us. Greetings, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We're delighted to have you for this special virtual seminar talking with our Stanford alum, Mike King. Thank you for joining us virtually. We wish we could have had everybody in person. More and more people are joining this meeting. So as you join, if you're willing, please turn your videos on. Make sure your mic is muted, please. And if you have a chance in the chat message, let us know where in the world you're joining us from. I'm very happy to be part of this gathering and celebrating Mike Ming. I am the chair of the Energy Resources Engineering Department. Our department has been evolving decade on decade, and we continue to build on our enormous strengths in subsurface engineering and flow modeling and the modeling of enhanced oil recovery, but we also have been engaging and growing in areas related to carbon capture and storage, energy systems analysis, optimization, and growing our footprint, both in research and teaching related to energy. After Mike's seminar, we have our PhD student, Cedric Gasmi, who will manage the Q&A and the interactions with Mike. But now let me hand it over to Professor Mark Zobak, who will introduce Mike Ming to the rest of us. Mark, it's yours.
Thank you, Hamdi. This is a pleasure for me for the second time in a week to introduce Mike. He's this year's winner of the school's Distinguished Alumni Award, and many of us couldn't be more pleased. And I'm really pleased to see the title of his talk, Creating a Better Global Energy Future. We all know the expression, think globally, act locally. Mike does both, and I look forward to his comments. I don't know exactly what he's going to say, but I have a few ideas, and I'm really looking forward to his talk. Mike's had a distinguished career, first as a graduate of what was the Petroleum Engineering Department, an undergraduate degree in 1980, a master's degree in 1987. He was a successful independent oil and gas developer in Oklahoma, and went on to be the first president of RPSEA, the Research Partnership to Secure Energy for America, which is where I got to know him for the first time. And it was really an opportunity for him at the national scale to provide energy leadership and energy support to, among others, universities around the country who were engaged in working on unconventional natural gas and unconventional oil. It was really a major contribution. He went on from there to become the Secretary of Energy for the state of Oklahoma, where he helped lead Oklahoma on the pathway to decarbonization in many ways and deal with a number of opportunities and issues in an extremely constructive way. In that position, he was trying to woo General Electric to establish a research and technology center in Oklahoma City. And he wooed so well that he was recruited by GE to be the first director of that facility. And Mike led its development, and it's really a world-class facility on what was an empty field. And Mike deserves a tremendous amount of credit for that. It's been my real pleasure to be a colleague of his and a friend of his for the past 10, 12 years. And I'm looking forward to his comments today. And it's great that Mike's won this award, and it's great that he's sharing his thoughts with us. So Mike, you're on.
Thanks, Mark. And thanks everybody in the school, Hamdi and Dean and Nick and the whole team there. This has been a lot of fun. The event that we had a week and a half ago was super fun, and it was fun to see familiar faces on there. And I'm seeing faces on here tonight that I haven't talked to in years, so this is especially cool. I won't repeat everything from a week and a half ago of my fun energy journey, but I'll kind of hit some of the highlights of it, and especially just a few of the people that prepared me in my journey and inspired me. One of whom I talked quite a bit about a week and a half ago, AJ Horn. And AJ just instilled in me a tremendous passion for energy. And when I came out of Stanford, historically, Stanford's known for reservoir engineering expertise, reservoir simulation, things like that. And I wanted to go be a driller. I wanted to be, where the action was, where the dollars were being spent. And understand, and this is one of several key messages I want to talk about tonight, that was a time of extraordinary energy scarcity. We were trying to get more energy in the United States. We had the issues in the 70s with oil embargoes and the Natural Gas Act and the Fuel Use Act and all these things. And so we were scrambling wherever we could. And so I went off to be a driller. And over that time frame of 20 plus years of being a hands-on petroleum engineer, designing wells, drilling wells, I knew how hard it was to find energy. But I also, during that time period, I knew how hard energy was, and to find, and especially the geopolitical insecurities that we had. And so energy efficiency was big, but back to that energy passion from AJ Horn, I kept the broader energy picture in mind. And so over my journey, operating petroleum engineer in a time of scarcity, and then during that time period, we actually had this phenomenal thing happen where we moved from scarcity to abundance. And there's a lot of implications of what scarcity to abundance means, especially for those students that might be on tonight and the role that they might play, in this new energy transition. And I say this, and I was reminded this morning on a panel for the Society of Petroleum Engineers, who's having their annual conference this week. This isn't the first energy transition we've had. We've had major ones in past centuries, from wood to coal, or, coal to oil. But the fact is, this one's happening, really quickly. And there's an important role for all of us to play in it. Just a few other things along that energy journey, from being a driller to an operating petroleum engineer. I got to work in research and development, like Mark mentioned, at RPSEA, and then as the Governor Secretary of Energy here in Oklahoma, I had the privilege to be able to help develop the state's first comprehensive energy plan. And that was really a special thing because it was not only actionable, but it actually had an impact, a significant impact over time. And I think you might be surprised if you're not familiar with some of the things that have happened in Oklahoma, the leading role it's taken in energy way beyond just oil and gas. So it'd be wind energy, energy efficiency, things like that. Nick, I'm getting some notes. I might still be scratchy on the audio. So you might want to knock the video off and just preserve a little bandwidth. So I apologize for that. So anyway, got to work on the policy side of things and had this fabulous run in the R&D side. And now the space I'm really working in is doing a lot in sort of the continuous improvement and decarbonization space. And when I say decarbonization, I don't mean it in the context of no oil and gas. I just don't feel like, you know, that's really going to happen. But there's a lot of ways that we can, you know, decarbonize our use of fossil fuels, and we're going to have to, and there's options, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So today, wherever you are, whatever your time zone is, you know, I'd like to delve a little bit more into this scarcity to abundance model, because I think it's fundamentally changed how and why we operate, especially in the oil and gas industry. I want to talk a little bit about energy poverty, and I say that in the context, climate change gets all the press, but there's a lot more issues. There's equitable access to energy around the globe. There's air, land, and water issues beyond just CO2. But I want to talk a little bit about that, and then, you know, just a little bit more on the decarbonization space, and really, as Mark says, you know, how they fit into this global energy future that we all together have to work to make it what the world needs it to be. If I can get my slides to advance here. So to set some framework on landscape, a few things that are fundamental right now. Energy in general is increasingly abundant, something that many of us never thought would happen, but it's not always equitably distributed. So there's a lot of places in the world that need it. With energy abundance, energy's become more affordable if you have it. But certainly, I'll give you an example here in Oklahoma in the early 2000s, natural gas prices at one point around 2003, 2004 sold for $18 a million BTU. In February of 2016, that same natural gas MMBTU sold for $1.80. That's a 90% reduction, okay? And then finally, energy is increasingly becoming cleaner and lower carbon. That's a case right here in Oklahoma, just with some practical market-based policy mechanisms. You know, we drove our carbon emissions down. Were Oklahoma, or were the clean power plants still in effect, Oklahoma would be in compliance with it just by using a practical portfolio of natural gas, wind, and energy efficiency. And it really, I said this scarcity to abundance model changes lots of things. And one of those is that in a scarcity model, producers really held all the cards. So it was a seller's market. And now really with more options, especially cleaner options, and options that don't impact the economics so much, consumers have choices, and they're influencing and they're exercising those choices. And so really, consumers are really a driver. And then finally, this space that I think a lot of you all have worked in, the world's going to need more energy, not less. And we're going to have to do it with less impact. And I know we can do that, and we can do it. You know, a few other thoughts. One size doesn't fit all. And what works in Oklahoma, for example, doesn't work in Georgia. And what works in California, for example, might not work in India. And so understanding these differences, especially between the developed and developing world, is critical, okay? I said before, decarbonization doesn't mean no oil and gas. We have to grow energy, and with still a vast majority of our energy supplied coming from fossil fuels, it would sound counterintuitive, but decarbonization and energy growth, while they can conflict, they're not necessarily incompatible. and a lot of work going on at Stanford and elsewhere in that space. Many of you understand the profound impact that electrification is going to have. But electrification itself isn't the only answer. There are certain places where there's more fundamental needs than that, like heating and cooking in thermal fuels. Pure electric vehicles, while they're going to be a very important part of the portfolio, aren't necessarily the only part of that portfolio. The hybrid electric, plug-in electric, and other hybrid models. And then a saying that I use for effective implementation and change, it can't just be one component. I say you have to have technology, policy, and market. So if the markets can't participate, a lot of times something will be dead in the water. So commercialization models, especially with regional application, are super important. What works in the United States may not work in sub-Saharan Africa, just from infrastructure and financial means and things like that. And then everything is really happening fast right now. 2020 sort of took that to a whole nother level, but everything is happening. But all that said, I think especially for those in the earlier parts of their career, and especially the students, there's a lot of opportunity out there in the energy space right now. So I said the world needs more energy. So I've drawn from several of the energy outlooks. This one happens to be from the EIA. If you haven't looked at the outlooks, a lot of which have come out this fall, whether it's corporate outlooks or government outlooks, the EIA has a great set of reports you can look at. But basically what you can see is the developed world, energy is pretty flat forecast, out to mid-century. Actually, energy services from that flat energy will go up because efficiency improvements. But in the developing world, they got a twofold increase in their energy consumption. Number one is just a growing population, which will require more energy. And then in a minute, I'll get more into per capita energy consumption going up, which is a proxy on standard of living. So you see all the growth really happens in the developing world. And I think for all of us, this is one of the challenges we have to rise up to and meet, because the developing world, they need the energy, they deserve the energy, their standard of living will go up. When that happens, their educational background will go up. When things like that happen, other good things come out of it. But as that energy grows over time, how it grows will change. So this is a slide from the Exxon outlook. And basically what it shows is energy demand in an absolute basis is going up, but not only the CO2 intensity per unit of that energy will go down, but the CO2 per unit of GDP will go down even more. And if you look on the right, you can kind of see for the developed world, on an absolute basis, its energy goes down, but its energy services go up because of the power of energy efficiency. In China, its absolute energy goes up, but its energy services go up dramatically more. And it just shows you the leverage that energy efficiency has on markets. And then India kind of does the same thing as China, but at a lower scale. And we'll talk a little bit more about India because of its importance globally, especially in a rising population. BP was set to release its outlook in the spring of this year. When COVID hit, they canceled that and they pushed it off till September. This one graph is really a shot across the bow. Their outlook came out in September, as I said, and it was very much redone. And effectively, what BP said, they had three scenarios. They had a business as usual scenario, which is the curve on top, a rapid scenario, which is in the middle, and a net zero curve on the bottom. But essentially what they've said is that oil demand didn't won't peak in 2030 or 2032, like McKinsey said just a year ago. BP said it's likely oil demand peaked in 2019. And that's a phenomenal thing. And if you look at a curve out to 2050, for those of us in the oil and gas industry, one of these profound implications of abundance from scarcity is that our job may be less, if we were historically called an exploration and production company, now our role may have changed from exploration to production. So our role now is, what do we have to do to manage this abundance rather than create it because it's there? And if you just did an integration of that curve and any of those curves, the area under that curve is still pretty high. That's a lot of barrels of oil. And our industry has to manage that abundance in a very sustainable way. We got to manage the carbon. We got to manage the air, land, and water impacts. We got to manage its equitable distribution around the world on the energy poverty side of things. But this was a telltale slide of where things have for BP to make a statement this strong. So on the energy poverty side, this is a slide, I think I got it from the NGI, the Natural Gas Initiative seminar a few years ago. But it's a few years out of date, but the main message here holds true. There's still a lot of the world that is energy poverty, but specifically electricity is a key to standard of living, and places that are electrified with lights and refrigeration and things like that are going to have a much higher standard of living. So there's a lot of people in that category, a lot of which are in sub-Saharan Africa and Nigeria in particular. So from a population and demographic standpoint, I think there's a couple things out there right now, that I've heard, like if you take China, India, and the United States from a population standpoint, it's projected Nigeria probably overtakes the United States in population in the not too distant future. And so this is important because, again, very low energy per capita consumption. But if you go to India, and again, I've drawn a couple slides from just a great event that Mark Zobak and the team did at the NGI a few years ago. If you look at a population demographic of India, it's going to overtake China in population. So not only is it going to have a lot of people, but if you look at per capita energy consumption, you can see how big the challenge gets. So in this, it illustrates in the United States, if you just look at electric generation capacity on the grid, the United States has about 1,500 watts per person. So in the old days, that was 15 light bulbs. Today it's 150 light bulbs. Europe's about half of that, but India's a fraction of that. And they have an objective that they want to take their 90 watts per capita. Again, in the old days, that was one light bulb. Today it's 10 light bulbs. But if they want to take that to 250 watts per person, that's a 3x increase if the population was static, much less if the population really grows. So you can see this challenge, and India still has a very significant amount of its electric generation from coal-fired power plants. And then I said, it's not always just about electricity. And I referenced this a week and a half ago. Mark Zobak and I use this slide a lot. But thermal fuels for heating and cooking are really important. And heating and cooking, which are fundamental needs for living and humanity, they're dangerous things in the developing world. And in this case, what the illustration is, indoor air pollution kills more people than tuberculosis, AIDS, and malaria, while the resources that are spent on it are inverse to that. And if you just look, and I think I saw Scott Tinker on the call, he does some great work in this area, but the implications of burning wood and charcoal and dung, whatever, in smoky huts, it's awful. Whether it's premature cataracts in young mothers that are in their 30s, these are bad things. And just, for example, the use of LPG gas in small canisters would significantly improve the quality of living, much less, the life expectancy in these countries. Going to CO2 a little bit, this graph, I think a lot of you have probably seen it. This is through 2019, but we're on a significant downward trend in the United States in absolute emissions of CO2. And if you look where that deflection point hit, it's actually not a surprise where it started. It's about 2006. And that's where shale gas really first started to hit the pipelines in quantities, while at the same time, wind energy was coming on strong and now solar energy is coming on. So you had a combination of the displacement of coal with natural gas, wind energy, energy efficiency, and now solar. So you have a pretty steady decline, and I don't see any reason why that decline doesn't continue. And for those of us in the energy industry, we have to find ways for it to continue while keeping the energy services up. And if you take this out, I think a lot of people would agree when this is completed next year through all of 2020, that curve's going to take a pretty good downward turn in 2020 just because of lower energy consumption due to the COVID pandemic. So how do we do this? What are some of the things we have to do? And I put this slide up, and personally, I know we're going to have to put carbon dioxide in the ground. A lot of work's going on at Stanford. There was a big release last week between Lenore and Sally and others at Stanford, and Ernie Moniz and Melanie Kinderdine. But this is an area that we have to continue to pursue. There's some positive developments in this area, one of which is very innovative tax policy called 45Q. If you're not aware of it, you should be. But I feel strongly one of the best places we can put CO2 in the ground is in depleted pore volume. So what that means historically, depleted pore volume has been a liability. Whereas today, depleted pore volume, I believe, is an asset for a lot of different reasons. One is you can put a lot of material into a small space. You don't change in situ pressures. You actually just probably restore in situ pressures. Lots of other policy reasons why this works, but this is a very important area where progress has to continue. And then I drew this slide. This is a study that was released a year or two ago from the Energy Futures Initiative. Again, that's Ernie Moniz's organization with Melanie Kinderdine. And this was specifically targeted at how California can meet its goals. And one of the things, if you just read the newspaper, you might say, well, it's all going to be electric vehicles and renewable energy. Actually, there's much more impactful ways that make a bigger difference, one of which is just plain old energy efficiency. And whether that could be in CAFE standards or others, okay, and CCUS. So I'm a practically oriented person. I don't think shooting for perfection when it gets in the way of progress has helped our cause. In fact, I'll make a strong case it hasn't helped us. It's impaired progress instead of advanced progress. But this is a practical approach of a very ambitious goal in California of the components that are going to be required to get there. And then I put this slide up because NextEra, if you're not familiar with NextEra, it's a large utility based in Florida. And one of the interesting things about NextEra is not only has their market cap overtaken some of the super major oil and gas companies, I think they're the 5th largest capital investor in the United States. And as a company, they build more renewables than almost any country in the world, probably save the United States. But what these pie charts represent is a progression over just a little over or about 25 years. And you can see from the left with almost 90% of their portfolio being powered by coal, nuclear, and natural gas. By 2030, that coal, nuclear, and natural gas falls in half. And if you look at this practical portfolio, and I like to call it like an operations research approach of an optimization, 70% of that portfolio in 2030 is natural gas, wind, and solar. And that's the direction they're moving, and the market's rewarded it for them. If you haven't been out to NextEra, go take a look at their stock ticker and see what their performance has been. And then just kind of talk about other tools in the toolbox that we can use. I continue to believe that hydrogen is a big part of our energy future. The economics are challenged on it right now, but they're improving. I never bet against technology. So I like this one. It makes too much sense not to do it. Interestingly, in one of the SPE talks, they were talking about the oil and gas industry, and one of the Middle Eastern producers said, you know, eventually we're going to become oil and gas, hydrogen, and CO2 companies. And so I think the industry sees this. I think energy storage is an enormous opportunity. While lithium-ion batteries have revolutionized the way we've done a lot of things, especially with mobile telecommunications and vehicles, they're still not a perfect thing, especially in the utility space, especially for longer storage. So we need more options there. Hydrogen is one of those that I play into that. And then we're going to have to continue to press to get capture projects, both for current emissions, but I wasn't always a big fan of direct air capture or carbon dioxide removal, however you want to call it, but I've actually warmed up to it for a lot of reasons because of the practicalities of where you can capture versus where you can sequester, and especially in areas like the Permian Basin. So I'll close it right there. I think we're going to have some time for Q&A. I like to view energy as a system because I think we viewed energy in discrete fuel silos. And in viewing it in silos, we've created small wars and battles instead of complementing the system and making 1 + 1 = 3. So, you know, I've challenged the dean, I've challenged others at Stanford. What will Stanford's role be, especially in an area where political correctness and what you read in the paper and social demographics would sometimes, again, point to this perfection, killing good. In reality, that's what's happening. So sometimes the decisions that and the actions that have to be undertaken are counter to sort of the prevailing public dialogue. And I've challenged the university, and I know there's a lot of good things going on, and I want to see that happen. But for everybody on the call, you know, I'd say, what is your role? And for someone that started out as a driller in Southwest Wyoming and then got to implement energy policy in Oklahoma, where we became a top 3 state in the nation in wind power, the single most improved state in the nation in energy efficiency, led 26 governors to adopt a natural gas vehicle platform, and brokered a landmark clean air deal where, in the objective of managing a air issue, regional haze, we also manage what's called criteria pollutants. At the end of the day, it led to Oklahoma having significantly lower carbon emissions. If we can do that in Oklahoma, we can do it anywhere. So I'll turn it back to you guys, and Cedric's on the phone, I think, to manage some questions, but I'd be glad to hear your thoughts, comments, questions, whatever you might have. But again, thanks to all of you for joining. It's special, and I hope all of you, and I know many of you are, playing a big part in creating a better global energy future.
Thank you, Mike, for a very insightful talk. So the Q&A session is now open. You have various options. The first one is to raise your hand on the camera, and I guess that's the old school one. And you'll be called upon to unmute yourself. And the other option is always to type in your question on the chat. I'll be monitoring that.
And also, Mike, it'll be great if you stop sharing and let us see you.
There you go.
Okay, let me be attentive on like who is raising their hands, but yeah. Okay, Hamdi, you have a question.
Can Mike, very interesting. You mentioned if it can be done in Oklahoma, it can be done anywhere. Any words of wisdom and insight for us to do it in California?
So it's interesting, when we implemented the energy efficiency initiative in Oklahoma, the ACEEE, the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, recognized Governor Fallon at an event in DC. And there was a line of people to ask her questions, and they were all Democrats from New England. And they wanted to know how a red state governor got this done. And the answer was, you know, it was market-based, okay? And so I think sometimes there's an intellectual honesty argument that has to go into it. I applaud California for the leadership role that it's taking. I candidly don't agree with every policy that California is trying to do, but having that intellectually honest conversation is important. And we did that here in a very collaborative way. And
Thank you.
We have
Lenore.
okay, we have a question from Len.
So Mike, it's great to see you. Congratulations. Thanks for a very nice talk. You know, when I talk about this stuff, energy efficiency is the first thing that I mention always, because it just study after study after study says it's the lowest cost thing you can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it has plenty of other benefits besides. And everybody, I think, the audiences I talk to say, yeah, that's good. But then the question is, okay, what do we do? That's so many decisions about, how we use energy sit out at the edge of the energy systems, where all those pesky humans make decisions on all kinds of reasons that may or may not have anything to do with greenhouse gas emissions. So what specifically did you do that convinced folks that aren't the energy zealots that a bunch of us are?
I think, Lynn, we started at the market side of things, and we started at the budget level. And in the case with the state, we started with the public universities, and the state-owned building fleet and the state-owned vehicle fleet, the things that were kind of birds in the hand, okay? And then from there, we worked with others, like on the building code groups. And, you and I have had many conversations about our personal homes and things that we do. But, I have a 3,000 square foot home with a 45 SEER geothermal heat pump, and I have an electric car. Now, we have really low electricity rates in Oklahoma, so I didn't mention that here. It's actually kind of a headwind when you have 9-cent electricity, how much you can save. But, my electricity bill last month in Oklahoma with an all electric house and an electric car was $110, okay? But, still the markets work, and you just go grab the opportunities that you can. And we started out on the budget side of things, and then we took it from there, but we kept it market-based.
So we have a question from the chat. Some large IOCs have made announcements about large ambition for zero emission. BP was one of the precursor there. Do you have any comments on what that may mean, or in general, any comment on this?
So the IOCs, they're in some ways they're in separate camps, and in some ways they're together. BP, if I'd recommend everybody on the call at least read the executive summary of the BP Energy Outlook. But their CEO has come out and said BP will move from being an international oil company to being an international energy company, okay? And that the world's going to need more energy. A lot of it's going to come from renewables, but not only renewables. The Europeans have certainly been much more aggressive. Shell, Total, Equinor, BP. But that said, some of the American or US IOCs have come out with policies that are sometimes surprising. Exxon's publicly on the record for carbon tax. Chevron has come out just in the last few days, and it's been pretty clear, but they're really making an enormous bet on natural gas, especially in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean with some of the large discoveries there. Most all of them are working very hard on fugitive methane emissions, which have been a blot on the industry. The Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which a lot of those companies are members of, is doing a lot of work in that space. But I think all of them collectively recognize the social license to operate. They come from social demographics as much as it does from regulatory agencies. And so they're working in that direction.
I have another question, probably like from there. We have a couple of students in the audience. So if there is a practical piece of advice that would you give to current students in the audience who would be interested in affecting large societal changes?
So I would say, number one, start out in an area, get deep in that area, and accomplish something in it. So, and at the same time, keep a broad perspective. So for 20 years, I was literally that hands-on operating petroleum engineer. But at the same time, I had that passion for the energy system instilled by A.J. Horn, where that was always in the back of my mind. And so be deep, be really good, but keep a broad perspective. And then in the development of your career, find a mentor or two, someone that you can go to and talk to. And I had several. But another important thing, and my wife and I have talked a lot about this, if you can find a sponsor which is different than a mentor is somebody that'll advise you. A sponsor is somebody that puts their neck out for you and helps you find those roles and gets you into that role, okay? And I've been fortunate in my career to have some great mentors. I've been really blessed to have a couple of sponsors, and getting in to roles where you can collectively have more impact will probably take both of those.
So we have a question. I guess I don't know if the person would like to ask. I can do that. So thank you for the I don't know. Okay. So on the so can you talk more about the journey that you've had? So obviously you have had a fun ride from corporate operational engineering to research and policy. There's one question asking, where have you learned the most? And the second one, where have you had the most fun?
So it's interesting, when I was an operational petroleum engineer, one of the people I learned the most from was our chief financial officer when I was an independent. And he taught me just a lot about how business works. And then kind of the fun and the learn, I think clearly building a company was a lot of fun with a couple of partners from 25 years. But the role to work for Governor Fallin here in Oklahoma on the energy side of things was in a lot of ways some of the most fun that I ever had. And I really, people ask me, they said, well, what did you think about politics? And I said, well, first of all, politics are a lot better if you're appointed rather than elected, because you don't have to put your name on a ballot box. But the second part of that is that I developed immense respect for anyone who has the courage to put their name on a ballot, because if you're elected, by and large, 51% of everybody's going to like the decisions you make, and 49% are going to not like the decisions you make. So you got to learn how to deal with that, and it takes a lot of courage. And so I know politicians are the brunt of a lot of jokes, but I developed immense respect for all of them that will participate in the process.
We have a question, especially about that, about international politics. So you've touched on the fact that different countries would need to have a different solution. And the question is about, we see the rise of international conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean, for example, with Turkey, Cyprus, Greece, etc. So with the urgency of refugee crisis and the need to have an access to cheap energy for this country, what do you think the world response should be, and how do you imagine a sustainable solution?
So it's interesting. I mentioned the Chevron announcements just here in the last week or so, and Chevron, they wouldn't be doing this if they didn't feel that those conflicts were manageable. And for example, the normalization of relations with Israel, with a number of, other countries that historically have been enemies of Israel, has been a real surprise. The discovery of enormous natural gas reserves in the Eastern Mediterranean, starting with the ones offshore Israel, but then moving down to Egypt, and then also, as you said, the Cyprus, Turkey. Those are tough issues, but I think that I have faith that some of those will be resolved, because the energy that it brings, it's not going to be perfect. A perfect solution probably won't ever be a solution. There'll probably have to be some compromise there. But the resources that are at stake make it where it's in everyone's best interest. So if that's the US or the EU or whoever else, to weigh in and carefully encourage that, however it may be, I think is important to the world. It's interesting. A very small U.S. company, Noble, made the big discovery, the Leviathan field, offshore Israel, and it completely changed the dynamics there. Noble was probably not capable of really fully developing that way from an upstream, midstream, downstream standpoint. And so the Chevron deal made a lot of sense there. But I think just Chevron coming in to that equation probably helps, and other countries and IOCs and NOCs will have to become involved also.
We have a question from Lynn on CCS. Lynn, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, so Mike, it sounded like you must have been part of the audience for the rollout of the California CCS study, and I'm just curious about your reaction to the kinds of things that were talked about. And is there? I mean, Oklahoma has a whole heck of a lot of pore space. Is there any prospect for CCS there, or I guess that's a place where only 45Q is the driving force, and there's no low carbon fuel standard as a motivator? But can you take the conversation last week to beyond California to other parts of the country?
Well, you know, Bello Kuskra at Advanced Resources International, he did work for the DOE, and they did a really deep dive assessment of the potential of enhanced oil recovery with CO2, and basically said Oklahoma has more potential for EOR than all barrels that have been produced in the state's history. And that's a field, it's intimidating talking to you as a world leader in, you know, CO2, but that's for fields where it's applicable, okay? And so when I would advocate it here in Oklahoma, number one, it allows the markets to participate. It allows the oil and gas industry, who owns the pore space, who has the infrastructure, who has the subsurface expertise, okay, who has the scale, okay? They have all these attributes to be a part of the solution, but the social media dialogue would say, we just need to do away with those companies when they're the ones that likely can solve it. So the argument I would make here is it creates wealth for shareholders, and it puts CO2 in the ground. Bello would describe this as net zero. So 45Q is clearly a driver. If there were a carbon price, the interview I did with Secretary Schultz a year and a half ago, we talked about that a lot. A carbon price would drive that also. Mm-hmm. But there's some other states out there. You know, I watched the event you described with Ernie and Melanie and Sally and you, and I haven't read the full report yet, but, you know, there's others that feel CCS, you know, may not be the silver bullet in California, but I strongly feel we're going to have to capture those emissions, you know, for that firming component addition of natural gas in the system. And California's, I think, probably actually a tougher political hurdle, because, as you know, the opposition says we don't want to do CCS or CCUS because it just prolongs fossil fuels. And again, I go back, that's just letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so it's like, on the one hand, you have an option to put put carbon in the ground on combustion of fossil fuels, okay? Or the other option is you just keep using fossil fuels and you don't put the carbon in the ground, which is kind of seeming like the path we're staying on. And I would like to see us go to the first, you know, as good being more productive than perfect.
Yeah, I think there's a worry about the relatively low price of oil. If we're successful as a world in reducing demand for oil through electrification or whatever, it may be a harder sell to get people to invest in CCS for EOR. But, you know, that's where the markets come into play, as I know you know.
Yeah, and then there's, you know, nuances in that, you know, like the capital investments for CCS on coal plants. Personally, I think that's a tough one, because utilities may retire the coal plants before they could ever pay for them. But I think, you know, like BP says, our oil demand is going to go down, but they also see a much longer glide slope on the gas side. And I think, you know, with the work that I've done with Ernie and Melanie, you know, CCS for gas is a very viable option that should absolutely be on the table.
Yeah, no doubt it can be done. You just have to handle a lot of gases. The concentrations of CO2 are low, but it can definitely be done.
We're about 3 minutes before the hour, so we'll be able to take one last question. Check. Okay, there's a question from Scott. Scott, do you want to ask your question? I can do this. Policymakers can help but try to pick energy winners, EVs over ICE, wind over natural gas, ethanol, etc. Given your market-based approaches, how do you respond to this?
So I saw a great quote in the op-ed this week, and it said, governments historically aren't good at picking winners, but losers are good at picking governments. And so I like that one. The challenge, Scott, and you've been such a leader in this space, is how you get the dialogue out there. So I'll just give a plug for Scott here. If you all haven't seen Switch or Switch On, go Google it, Google Scott, and getting the word out there so we can have a more productive conversation. For starters, I think it ought to be more of a bipartisan conversation than a partisan one. And I go back to Governor Fallon when we were working here. We were doing the natural gas vehicle initiative. We got 26 governors, and Governor Fallon was a Republican. We were working through what's called the National Governors Association. And John Hickenlooper at the time was the governor of Colorado, and Governor Hickenlooper is a Democrat. And the two of them rolled it out jointly, and it was totally a joint initiative of both of them. And I think it gained a lot of traction that way. So I think policies help, but creating markets, and this is where, you know, I don't know if a pure carbon price is the right way, but as Secretary Schultz says, if it's an insurance policy, we got to figure out what the insurance premium is we're willing to pay. So what's the odds that your house is going to burn down? They're pretty low, okay? But you still buy house insurance, okay? And the reason you do is because of the economics of it. And so what is that insurance policy we're willing to pay on the CO2 emissions? So combining technology, policy, and markets, I think, as a three-legged stool is the way we did it, and then the way I described what we did with Governor Fallon.
Thank you, Mike. So I think we will now turn it to Steve to provide some closing remarks. Mike has agreed to answer all of the questions that we were not able to address within the hour, and you should receive a response by now. Thanks again, and I'll turn it to Steve.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cedric. Well, Mike, I really want to extend a huge thank you for joining us and spending time with the Stanford community. It's been great to get your perspective on future energy demand and all of its ramifications. I'm sure this has been insightful for many people in the audience. Let me just say that Mike has been a huge friend to Stanford Earth over the years. He served on multiple terms on the school's advisory board. And on a personal note, Mike's been a great friend to me for many years, and he's been tremendously supportive of me in the position of dean, as I'm sure he was previously for Lynn, who's on this call, and Pam, who's not with us today. And I certainly appreciate that, as I'm sure did Lynn and Pam. So thank you from the heart here, Mike. And thanks, Cedric, for your work in helping to moderate the conversation. As Cedric just said, if there were questions we didn't get to, we'll be happy to collect them. Mike's very generously offered to provide answers, and we'll be continuing the conversation over the coming days with email. I also want to give a thanks to the ERE department and to Stanford Earth colleagues in the Dean's office who helped behind the scenes for today's seminar. And especially thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us. So as you know as well as I, this year continues to be a year unlike any other. But in adjusting to our new routines, we have been able to find some silver linings. And one of those for me has been the ability to more easily connect with others. And in this vein, I encourage you all to stay in touch with your Stanford Earth community by visiting our website, earth.stanford.edu, where you'll find our events webpage and many virtual events like this one. And so as always, never hesitate to reach out and be in touch directly. I'm always available if you want to send an email directly to me. And thank you all again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much. And thank you, Mike.